go to the AFC South now for our next division here. We're establishing some team needs, pre-free agency, of course, for all these teams here in the AFC. Houston Texans. Right around where the cap floor is. They're a little bit in the red. Negative 2.9 effective cap space is 23rd in the NFL. That's something that it's not too difficult to really get cap compliant there, and they'll probably have an opportunity to go out and make a little bit of splashes here and there. Maybe not the biggest splash, but pending free agents that they have. Eric Murray, their safety, he played a lot of snaps for them this past season. Stephon Diggs coming off the ACL tear, but he was scheduled to be a free agent this offseason as well. Robert Woods, so the veteran depth piece of the wide receiver room, also hitting free agency. Foley Fudukasi, Derek Barnett, Dario Ogunbowale, their third down back there, Neville Hewitt as well. So you get a couple of players that Stephon Diggs, definitely a big one for them, but a lot of depth players that could also mean a lot towards this team, depending on whether or not they bring them back and how it could look a little bit different for them. What's some team needs that you have here for the Houston Texans, Dalton?
Yeah, this is one of the easier ones because the first thing that stands out to you is the interior on both sides of the ball, right? Interior pass protection for C.J. Stroud needs to be the number one priority here. You saw that, especially in games against better defenses or even in the playoff game when they just couldn't block really any of the blitz packages they were getting, or they couldn't figure out how to block Chris Jones. They're just not good enough, especially on the inside right now, to pass protect at a Super Bowl caliber level, right? So I think that's going to be the first thing, is protecting C.J. Stroud. And then on the other side of the ball, they need run stoppers, right? I think this team, when they get ahead of you and they can really pin their ears back and just play pass defense, you've got an elite edge rushing duo, you got great corners on the outside. You don't want to throw the ball into the teeth of this defense, but you can run on them right now, right? So I think defensive tackle, to me, is a spot where they're in the bottom 5 of run defense grade, and they need to get a lot better, and they're going to have a lot of options. Again, I keep saying it. It's a loaded defensive line class, and there's a boatload of run stoppers. I think this draft class is really going to work to the Texans' advantage, especially you've mentioned them as a trade-down candidate from the first round before. They could really build that depth that you're talking about on the defensive line. And then the other question is, okay, who do we have at receiver right now other than Nico Collins? I think they need more of that movable chess piece receiver that Stephon Diggs was supposed to give them before his injury, right? And now you have Tank Dell with another big injury. So I think you're talking about, you mentioned depth. That's really the key here, right? Depth on the interior, the offensive line, depth at defensive tackle, and then depth behind Nico Collins at receiver. He's one of the best receivers in football, but you can't just have one threat and expect to really contend for a championship. So that's the biggest question for me. I think Stephon Diggs, like you mentioned, is an interesting name, and I think you mentioned, considering the cap space situation, they're going to be looking to find some value at very specific spots on this team that won't be at the top of the market, but they can still improve.
When I think about defensive tackles or run stuffers, yeah, I mean, they could potentially pick a guy like a Walter Nolan from Ole Miss in the first round. They're picking pick number 25 right now. Kenneth Grant from Michigan, Tyleek Williams from Ohio State. I think all those guys make sense for the Houston Texans, but honestly, I would wait if I were them. I would wait until at least their second round pick, because they only have 6 picks, but they have a first rounder, a second rounder, a third rounder, a fourth rounder. They have Buffalo's 5th rounder. Don't have one in the 6th, but then they do have one in the 7th. So it's one less than if they were just scheduled to have their regular 7, but it's still okay for them. I would wait. I'd be waiting if I were them, because you get a little bit further down the draft, and you've got guys like Tim Smith from Alabama, Zeke Biggers from Georgia Tech, Cameron Jackson from Florida, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon. There's just a lot of J.J. Pegues, maybe Jordan Phillips from Maryland. Like, there's a lot of guys that you can get later on that interior defensive line. So if I'm the Texans, I'm more prioritizing, okay, do you need that secondary receiver with Nico Collins? Like, do you have a chance to pick a Matthew Golden from Texas and Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State? Like, those two guys, maybe even a Luther Burden, if Luther Burden makes it to you at number 25. I would think about that at one of those spots. Or is one of those offensive tackles who you think are probably going to kick inside to interior, or is one of those guys available? Like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, is he going to be available for you? I don't think Armand Membu is going to be there from Missouri, but sometimes he's had a late first round projection, so maybe he's a player there. Donovan Jackson from Ohio State, somebody who I think could be a big difference maker there for them along the interior offensive line to really hit that biggest possible need. That's where I'd go in terms of a draft strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it makes a lot of sense with the amount of run stuffers that there are in this draft. I think a receiver, I think Ibuka would fit really well in kind of what Stephon Diggs' role was supposed to be. Just a guy you can motion all around the formation and really do anything. He's a very willing blocker, too. He can help your run game. And I think you mentioned all those run stuffers, and a guy in the second round I could see them going after is Alfred Collins from right down the road in Texas. And I think the big appeal with Collins for me is the number of different alignments that you can put him in, right? Like some of those guys you mentioned, they're just one techniques. They're just going to plug up the A gap, right? Or maybe they're just three technique penetrators. Collins can do it all. He can allow you to mix up your fronts, and you can really build your whole run defense around him. So I think the fact that he's a more movable piece is why he's someone who's higher on the list than some of those other guys you mentioned. But like you said, this team, they need to be able to protect C.J. Stroud. They need to be able to run and stop the run. And certainly for stopping the run, they've got a lot of options. So I get not going unless there's a premier talent that they feel like is higher on their board than their pick. I get not going defense in the first round because at the end of the day, if this team's going to win a Super Bowl, they're going to do it around C.J. Stroud, right? You need to make that your biggest priority.
I would agree. Indianapolis Colts here. Colts have 24.3 effective cap space. That's the 18th most in the NFL. Some pending free agents that they have. Ryan Kelly, their starting center. Mo Alley Cox, starting tight end. EJ Speed, starting linebacker for them. Deo Odeyingbo, rotational starting defensive lineman. Julian Blackman, who we've talked about here already on this show as a potential guy who could move in free agency. Their safety there. Will Fries, who's having a really good season before he went out with injury. Joe Flacco as well. It's worth pointing out that he is a free agent because you got to talk about sort of quarterback position. And all right, maybe they're not going to be the starter over Anthony Richardson to start the season. How long is the leash here for Anthony Richardson in the year 2025? So I think those are things that you have to talk about here. And Dalton, what are some team needs that you have for this team as it stands right now?
So it sure seems like they're going to bring in at least some sort of competition, right, for Richardson. And I don't think it's at the level of Sam Darnold, who's going to be probably the highest paid free agent quarterback this offseason. But, this is the one spot where I have thought about, despite all of the other stuff, and there's a lot to put up with for sure, and it'll be a whole circus, but this is the one spot where I still think actually that Aaron Rodgers might be able to go and play well. If he were to, I don't know if he'd be named the starter right away, if he's going to play over Richardson, or if they would compete, or how that would work. But you look at the way this offense is set up. You've got a good offensive line. You've got Michael Pittman and Josh Downs and Alec Pierce outside. You still have Jonathan Taylor in the backfield. I mean, there's a lot going here, plus a really good play caller in Shane Steichen, aside from tight end, because that's really the one big weakness on offense, and there's a guy in the draft that we might get to if they drop to his spot. But, I think about in free agency, Aaron Rodgers might be someone they think about. Maybe a Kirk Cousins is somebody they think about. It feels like they would bring in one of those one-year veterans, I think, that can just come in and functionally run the offense, because that's really the biggest problem with Richardson is the lack of footwork and the lack of accuracy. They just don't get enough first downs, right? And I get the home run balls are great, but you have to be able to move the chains, right? We've seen that. Look, Philadelphia was like that. Kansas City made a Super Bowl doing that again this year, of just get first downs by any means necessary, and that's what this offense is designed to do. And then I think some more pass rush depth, right? You mentioned Odeyingbo's a free agent. They drafted Leatu Latu last year, but Kwity Paye hasn't really become the star that they wanted him to be. I think a little more help off the edge would help them and just get the rotation going before, hopefully, obviously for them, Latu turns into a star and they can build behind him, but they need a little more from that four-man rush.
You've got Kyle McCord here on the sheet as a guy who they could also look at quarterback, if they don't do anything in the pro market. I like that. I also like, who else I like for this team as a quarterback, if you sort of get into the mid rounds and he's available early day 3, whatever it is? Dylan Gabriel from Oregon. I think that some people look at this situation with the Colts and they'll go, well, okay, well, if you got Richardson, just draft Jalen Milroe, right? I mean, it's sort of the same thing, sort of the same archetype. Like, okay, well, if Richardson's not good enough, you could take a chance on Milroe, and it's sort of the same offense. It's built around a dual threat quarterback. Or you could say, all right, we'll take Riley Leonard, right? Sort of the same thing, like a guy who's got that dual threat ability to him. I would almost go the opposite, not the complete polar opposite, but I would rather a Kyle McCord or a Dylan Gabriel be the young rookie backup to Anthony Richardson, because kind of exactly what you said with Aaron Rodgers. Now, the Rodgers element of it is very interesting because I also agree with you. I think Indianapolis would be a great landing spot for Aaron Rodgers. Would Aaron Rodgers go to a situation where he basically does not have the ability to start right out of the gate? Like, there's not really a quarterback competition to be had. They're going to let Richardson start next season. Because if that's the scenario, let's say this is like the best case scenario for Rodgers, right? And it's like, okay, well, you kind of got to sign here. Would he just retire then at that point? Would he just say, no, okay, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm going to be done. Because if he's not, then I do agree with you. I actually like this spot for Rodgers. But I think it's more unlikely than it is likely that he would land in Indianapolis. And instead, if you're drafting something, go draft a quarterback who knows how to operate from the pocket. Like, can you imagine Dylan Gabriel? I know it's very different going from Anthony Richardson to Dylan Gabriel, but Gabriel, like you said, get a good offensive line in front of you, got a good run game in theory, got good offensive weapons to throw the ball to. Gabriel knows how to play quarterback. You could plop him into the NFL and, like, I don't think he's going to look super overwhelmed. Is he going to be chucking the ball 40, 50, 60 yards down the field all the time? No. But he's going to be able to sort of West Coast this offense a little bit down the field because of the playmakers that they already have at some really great positions. So I like the Aaron Rodgers thought. And my head actually goes to, if they aren't able to do that, getting a quarterback who's of that mold. What do you think for that team?
Yeah, no, I think, what I was looking at as far as the draft guys is that Shane Steichen's offense is very RPO heavy. So I was kind of looking at which guys in this class ran the same kind of offense, whether it be this year or throughout their careers in college football. So McCord was one. They ran him at a very high rate at Syracuse. Gabriel's always run him wherever he's been. Curtis Rourke from Indiana was another guy I think could get into this offense and function reasonably well and just do the things that Shane Steichen tells him to. It's not the most complicated offense. They need to be able to execute, and they want to play it fast. So I think any of those guys could be an option. And I don't think this is a team that would go early in the draft, right, in the first two rounds at quarterback, because they still believe there's something obviously there with Richardson. But those guys as options in rounds maybe 4, 5, 6, I think it absolutely makes sense. You just keep taking swings at guys. And look, we've seen it with other teams, right? You take swings at, at depth at quarterback. If you think a guy is good enough to be on your roster, go ahead and take him. It's how the Niners ended up with Brock Purdy, right? It's how the Eagles even ended up with Jalen Hurts, even though that was in round 2. If you feel like that player fits and you can make him into something, you take him. So I do think maybe even early on day 3, any of those guys could be options. And then the one other thing I want to talk about here, with their first round pick, man, Trev, if Tyler Warren's on the board at 14,
well, that's his floor.
That's the floor. We're starting to think he could go in the top 10. But if he ever got there, or if they ever decided they were trading up for a guy like that, boy, he would be a perfect fit. I felt it with Brock Bowers last year, and he just didn't quite fall to them, and I feel the same way with Tyler Warren this year. This offense with a tight end that can make things happen after the catch would be absolutely nasty. It would be almost hard for Richardson to fail at that point if all those receivers were in and Tyler Warren was in there too. So, I think that's a guy that would be a prime target for me in round 1. But otherwise, they do have options when you talk about the secondary, the defensive line they could still go after. I think they're another team that could dip into this running back class to get some depth going. So they have options, but I keep thinking about that. I'm like, if Tyler Warren ever fell to 14, they would be living.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said there. I am curious as to whether or not they would believe enough in Colston Loveland to also say, yeah, we take him at 14. I don't know. Maybe that would be the case. I'm not sure they love him enough at 14 to make that happen, but perhaps they looked at the success that Brock Bowers sort of had as that slot receiver, tight end type of a player to make it happen. One other thing before we move on. The chat, people in the chat are saying this, and I'm not trying to say that you're wrong here. There's a lot of people who said it. Shoot, I feel like maybe I've even said this before, but the idea of, well, they got to go get a tight end because then Richardson has no excuses. If that's sort of your line of thinking, Richardson already doesn't have any excuses. He's got all the receivers that he would want to have. He has Jonathan Taylor. He has a great offense in front of him. It's not like if he failed this past year, like let's say the Colts drafted, I don't know, somebody else on defense who would be pass rusher. Let's say they drafted Mike Green. All right, I'm just throwing out a name, right? They draft defense in the first round. They don't get Colston Loveland. They don't get Tyler Warren. If Anthony Richardson struggles this past year, it's not like anybody's going to say, well, he didn't have a tight end. There's too much evidence now to where it's all on him anyways. It doesn't even really matter. A tight end would be great for this team. Not trying to say don't draft a tight end, but I'm saying the Richardson part of this equation is basically independent of any offensive player that they would draft. Because if this is your franchise caliber type of quarterback, look at the offense that the Colts have. It's a pretty dang good offense that at most quarterbacks in the NFL, really all quarterbacks in the NFL that are starting caliber players should be able to operate under. So for AR, it's basically all him at this point. Let's move on to Jacksonville. The Jacksonville Jaguars, 24.6 effective cap space. It's 17th most in the NFL. So basically the same situation that the Colts are in. They're free agents. Brandon Sheriff's a free agent along the offensive line. Mac Jones, backup quarterback there for them. Andre Sisco, I think that's a big one. How much did they believe in Andre Sisco as their safety moving forward? Enough to give him that big contract there. And then you get some depth guys, Jeremiah Ledbetter, Luke Farrell, like some players like that. But the big ones, I think, are Brandon Sheriff and Andre Sisco and kind of what happens there with them. But they'll be looking to make some additions, some signings elsewhere in the pro market, and then make some splashes in the draft as well. Team needs for the Jags. What do you got?
I think you mentioned it. It's a lot like Houston, where they need to fix up this interior to protect Trevor Lawrence, right? That's really been the issue for the last year and a half. It's just not enough pass protection for him, and we've seen it with injuries on multiple fronts here. We saw it, I believe it was a leg injury in 2023. This year it took off scrambling and got the concussion and had a shoulder issue. So they need to protect Trevor Lawrence. I mean, you have weapons on the outside that can succeed, especially Brian Thomas Jr., but if your quarterback's not protected, you really can't get anywhere. Safety, like you mentioned, that's somewhere they have to get better. Now, I do think they weren't coached all that well in the secondary this year, but, between the lack of talent at safety and then the lack of execution from the unit as a whole, that's somewhere they can improve. And then, I think something people have been talking about a lot, especially when it comes to that 5th overall pick, is an impact two-way defensive tackle that can change the look of their front seven. They're pretty set at linebacker. They're pretty set on the edge, but in the middle of their defense, especially in run defense, there's just not a whole lot going there for them. So I think there's some fixable spots for them, right? And I think about finding starting caliber players in these spots. You look at free agency. I think somebody like Justin Reed from Kansas City could be a plug-and-play starter for them who could really improve them. Just functionally, one of those players who's so fundamentally sound. If they wanted to get top of market in free agency instead of the draft for a defensive tackle, you could be looking at the Eagles' Milton Williams, who obviously just had a huge year and had a really big Super Bowl. And even going to the Eagles again there, if you wanted a guard, there's major issues for this team, especially at right guard. I think Mekhi Becton is someone who had a bounce-back year this year. Really good run blocker, could fit in with some of Liam Cohen's run schemes. I think that's a spot where if they want to run the football and they want to get better on the interior, on both sides of the ball, Becton and Williams, they could look to Philly, and what better place to look, right, when you're looking for trench help. But, and then, again, the talk has been in the draft, Mason Graham maybe with that 5th overall pick, right? He's been the best defensive tackle in college football the last 2 years. Really, it feels to me like arguably the safest pick in the draft. And again, positions of emphasis I'm looking at. The center, Jared Wilson from Georgia, I think is actually going to be an excellent player. I think, Trevor, he could sneak into round 2. I think right now he's the most polished center in this draft. And then Andrew Makuba from Texas at safety. Again, fundamentally sound, really good tackler, had a breakout at Texas, really, really played well in a heavy zone scheme and was asked to kind of be the captain of that secondary. So I think there's a lot of players in this draft and even in free agency that can help this Jags team get better pretty quick. I don't think they're that far off when you look at being, okay, maybe a wild card contending team, right? This is not a team completely devoid of talent, but just the last year and a half, it felt like the morale was shot and they weren't coached very well this past season.
Yeah, Ladarian, I see the super chat. I'm going to get to that in a second. We're going to kind of finish out talking about the Jags, and then I'll get back to the super chat. So I want to know that is coming. I think that you are right that the reason why we've been so frustrated with things in Jacksonville is because we don't think they're that far away from really competing. And it feels as though it's like, all right, well, one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back, another step back, 2 steps forward. And so it's just they can't really take that leap into being one of the powerhouse teams in the AFC, and maybe they'll have the chance to, as some of these teams who are obviously riding high right now, maybe they'll just have their waves and go through a little bit of a valley here, and maybe Jacksonville could time it right and be one of those teams that's hitting their peak at the right time. I think they need to get better along the interior offensive line. I agree with you. I think Jared Wilson is big for this team. Morris has not been what you wanted him to be with consistency and impact play, so getting Wilson, I think, makes a ton of sense for them somewhere on day 2. I agree with you. He is. Now, I don't know if he's one of the most polished centers in the class. One, there's not a lot of great interior offensive linemen, so I guess the bar is a little bit lower this year than it is in years past. So that sort of goes into it. But he is at least a great athlete. He's the type of player that you would really want to invest in the center position. So I do like that. The center from Georgia, like that idea there. Obviously, Mason Graham's a great idea there for them. I I don't think they'll spend money on the defensive line because Arik Armstead's already making a good chunk of change for them. Josh Hines-Allen is as well. Trayvon Walker's a free agent next year. You've got Armstead on the books for another, I think, 2 years, and then he's a free agent in next offseason. So if they're going to go with an impactful defensive lineman, I do think it's going to be from the draft, and I do like the Mason Graham call out there. He's my favorite pick for them at number 5, so I think that one makes the most sense. I think if you're going to invest some capital in something, it's going to be the offensive line. It's going to be that interior offensive line, whether you're trading Sheriff out for something else or you're just drafting another interior offensive lineman somewhere on day 2 to really compete for one of those starting spots, or maybe both. I think that could be something that you could bring up there as well, making sure the offensive line is what it needs to be for their new offense coordinator Liam Cohen. Anybody else that you would want to bring to the table as a suggestion for this team? We're moving on.
I think in the draft too, the other spot maybe we look at is corner. If for any reason, say, at the very top, if Travis Hunter were to fall to 5, I think that's an easy pick for them as well. But I think we'll see them looking at cornerback, get somebody across from Tyson Campbell on the other side as well. That might be if Hunter's not there on the board at 5, and maybe they go with Will Johnson, but I think they would go with Graham over Johnson. Then you start looking. I think on day 2, corner might be an emphasis too.
Ooh, Brian's saying Will Campbell at 5, better choice than Mason Graham at 5.
Are we moving him inside in that spot? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think that we would be moving him inside. I love me some Will Campbell, but I can't subscribe to that. I'm a big Mason Graham guy. I think he's going to be one of the best players from this draft. Going back to Indianapolis right now, I think that we go back to some Indianapolis things I'm seeing in the chat. One, Tom said, love the idea of drafting a quote-unquote young backup in Dylan Gabriel for Indianapolis, even though he's 2 years older than Anthony Richardson. That's a fair point, Tom. That's a fair point that you make there. That's a good call out there by you. And then Ladarian gives a super chat a little bit earlier, said, what about trading Michael Pittman and the 14th overall pick to Carolina to move up to number 8? So it's a 6-position pick swap there. You're trading Michael Pittman because I think the thought process there is like, all right, well, you got A.D. Mitchell, you have Alec Pierce, you have Josh Downs, you might be able to go up and get Tyler Warren, although it's kind of funny because if you're trading up to 8 in that scenario, you're still 1 pick behind the Jets, who are becoming a popular mock draft destination spot for Tyler Warren. Right off the top of my head, I don't think they do that. One, because what you're giving up in Michael Pittman doesn't get you as high as you would want in the order. Like you're going to number 8 and you're getting in the top 10, and to me, like, that's nice. Obviously, you'll have some better players to choose from, but the gap between 8 and 14 and the player that you might have to choose versus how good Michael Pittman Jr. is, I don't think that way. Like, if you actually wanted to make that deal with Carolina specifically, you'd also have to get something more back, in my opinion, from Carolina. Carolina would be having to give you something back to get Michael Pittman Jr. So I understand, hey, Carolina needs a wide receiver, one type of a player. We could give them that. We can make a pick swap, but I think they would get even more from Carolina in that scenario. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think if you were going to involve Pittman in a trade, you would then maybe do something drastic like get into the top 5, and maybe if they were feeling like turning over completely a new leaf at quarterback, which is unlikely, or trying to get an elite talent, say like Travis Hunter, like even a Mason Graham, or get ahead, like you mentioned, of the Jets and Tyler Warren. I think if you're going to trade Pittman, it's further up than 8. You're making a drastic move at that point.
The Tennessee Titans, next team that we're talking about here to round out the AFC South. Titans have 35.7 in effective cap space coming up for free agency. That's 13th in the NFL. A couple of key free agents here for them. Dylan Radins, Tyler Boyd, Nick Westbrook-Akine, the touchdown monster, Daniel Brunskill, Jerome Baker, Sebastian Joseph Day, Darrell Baker Jr., the cornerback. So they've got a handful of guys that think offensive line is a big priority for them. I don't want to sort of steal your thunder when I ask you about some team needs, but Dylan Radins being on that list certainly goes into that. Daniel Brunskill being on that list certainly goes into that. Making some changes along the offensive line. You've got some potential wide receiver moves as well, right? You moved on from DeAndre Hopkins in the middle of the season last year. Now you got Tyler Boyd and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, who are both free agents as well. Oh my goodness, the Treylon Burks has not, sorry, I forgot his name for a second, has not developed the way that you would want him to. Your thoughts on this team overall, some team needs for them?
Look, I think we're going to know very soon how their entire offseason is going to play out based on how free agency goes. Because right now, it feels like there's no way they can walk into next year with their current quarterback situation, right? So the decision is going to be, do they go and sign somebody functional like a Sam Darnold and then build a team around him in this year's draft? Or do they figure out some other options? Do they get better off the edge? Do they get better at receiver in free agency? Another team that you go, okay, T. Higgins is kind of on the list here, and I think that's why T. Higgins is such a big story in free agency is because the number of teams where he would fit in and improve that situation, right? I think Tennessee is another one. Do they want to go that route and spend their money on the rest of the roster kind of like they did last year and then wait and then by the end of March, if not earlier, we're going to know whether or not they're taking a quarterback number one overall, right? I just don't think it's feasible at all that they could walk into next year with Will Levis as their starter, as their only option, right? So, quarterback, the right side of their offensive line needs work. They need help at receiver, especially after trading DeAndre Hopkins. I know they have Calvin Ridley, but they need more than that. And then, I think some help off the edge. They had the highest graded group of defensive tackles in the league last year with Jeffrey Simmons and T'Vondre Sweat leading the way with that. But they need some real juice off the edge as a pass rusher. So, I think somebody like Josh Sweat in free agency could be a target for them. I wouldn't be shocked to see them get kind of towards the top of the market for edge defenders. But they have a lot in this team that they need. I mean, obviously, and it starts with the quarterback spot, and that's really going to be the first domino to fall.
I like the Josh Sweat call out. I hadn't thought of that before. That one makes a ton of sense for me. Team's got money to spend. Josh Sweat, obviously great in the Super Bowl. I like that for them.
They just need anything off the. I mean, you really look at their pass rush and what they didn't get off of the edge this past year. They need anything. It would be a substantial improvement, even if he's not, say, a Parsons or a Garrett or somebody like that. It would be a massive improvement considering what they've been running out there.
We will. I think that what you said at the beginning is totally correct with the Titans. We will know whether they're drafting a quarterback at 1 or an edge rusher at 1 in 3 weeks or whenever free agency is. If they make a big splash at edge rusher, they're obviously honing in a quarterback at the very top of the draft. If they go sign or trade for a big name quarterback, could very well be taking Abdul Carter at number 1. Shoot, I mean, we could even throw in Travis Hunter at number 1 as well. I don't want to say that's not a factor, but I feel as though we're going towards two paths here, taking Abdul Carter, taking Cam Ward, or I guess the third path would be if you feel good about it and you got a great trade down option, you're trading down as well. But I think wide receiver is kind of independent of either of those. I think you're looking to make a big splash anyways. You mentioned a T. Higgins, a Chris Godwin, maybe somebody like that. Going after one of those wide receivers that might be available around the league, to me, that could make sense. Maybe this is a destination for a Cooper Kupp type of a player. I think that making a wide receiver splash is independent of whether they're going edge rusher or quarterback at number 1 there. So that's sort of my thought with the Titans as well. I think that offensive line, to me, also has to be a major talking point here. You play J.C. Latham at the left side of the line of scrimmage next to Peter Skoronski. Does a situation present itself where you can draft a left tackle? Maybe you could trade down, draft a left tackle, move J.C. Latham back to right if you're comfortable with that, if you think that's the best case scenario, or maybe you have the chance to draft an Armand Membu and he can play right tackle for you anyways, and you can keep J.C. Latham at left, whatever it is. The offensive line was, as much as quarterback play was not good enough in Tennessee last year, the offensive line was also not good enough, and I think the receiving corps has got to get better too. So anything else here before the Titans, before I go to the chat, because we got some questions here.
No, I think that's just why I threw a couple of day 2 options in there that I think could really help them. You talk about somebody like TCU's Jack Bech at receiver that they could get early in the second round, I think would be a really good fit for them and a good complement to Calvin Ridley. And then if they were going to leave Latham at left tackle, then I think somewhere on day 2 you think about maybe a starting right tackle, somebody like Ozzie Trapilo from Boston College, who to me I think is actually a pretty easily projectable starter. Maybe not an all-pro player, but I think he could start at right tackle for them immediately and be an improvement.
I agree, man. Ozzie is somebody who I think is going really underrated on this offensive line class, so I like that. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe the video, and if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription, you can get one to see all the premium stats that we talked about here on the show, plus the expert betting and fantasy advice over at subscribe.pff.com. The description is also right below, so if you are not a PFF Plus subscriber, you can become one today.